Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our third webinar of the series Screens. It is my pleasure and privilege this afternoon to introduce a dear friend and a colleague, Professor Ophelia Deroy. She's not only a philosopher and a cognitive scientist, but also a brave sailor who managed to sail even in Antarctica. Although, unfortunately, she will not talk about her many travels, but a most urgent topic, which is our relationship with the web. Ophelia Deroy holds the chair in philosophy of mind at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. She is the former deputy director of the Institute of Philosophy at the University of London, where we were colleagues for 3 years, where she also had the research position. She is a specialist in philosophy of mind and cognitive neurosciences, and has widely published on issues related to multisensory perception and social interactions, both in philosophical and scientific journals. She's an active promoter and leading advocate of stronger connections between philosophical and scientific approaches to the mind. Her work is frequently broadcast in national and international newspapers, and she is regularly consulted by institutions and the media regarding the relevance of philosophy for scientific debate. So it's a great pleasure to host you, Ophelia. You will talk on the topic, why the web needs bubbles. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Vittorio. Thank you. It's really a great pleasure to be here and to have been invited to speak in this series. Very ambitious and timely topic. And today actually it gives me the opportunity to present a sort of big picture view of various aspects of the work I've been doing about or relation to objects and contents, both online and offline, and try to systematize the conclusions I want to draw for our relations to online contents. So because of this big picture, some aspects will be covered quite quickly, but hopefully the structure of the arguments will be clear and engage with your questions and complementary information. So that's the introduction, and I guess I will jump in the things. I have to share my screen with you. Okay, so you should normally see my screen. Is that okay? Do you see my slides? Somebody needs to respond to me. That's the loneliness of the web.
Yes, it's fine.
Okay, great.
Everything is working.
That's okay. So the type of arguments I'm interested in discussing and rather objecting to actually is what I call the idea that the web has made us information miserable. And this is a sketch of the argument that I think we have all been exposed to in one way or the other. We think as a premise that informational bubbles are mostly bad, and I will come back to exactly what we mean by informational bubbles technically, but the fact that we basically interact and get information from people who share the same, not only evidence, but also the same take on the evidence that we have about a given domain. So this is mostly something which has bad consequences or is founded on bad principles. The second idea that constitutes this argument is that somehow the various ways in which information is either organized or distributed on the web, be it via social media, but also other type of content providers. It could be browsers, it could be news providers like official newspapers. That this way, the way information is organized will promote this type of informational bubbles. And the conclusion that you always find being drawn from these two premises naturally is that because of this, the web has made things worse. Now, there is a general argument here that leads to practical debates about whether we should actually change or regulate the distribution of information on the web because of the need to burst these bubbles. And this aspect of the sort of practical implications of the argument will be more in the background of my talk. I will come back to them at the end. But of course, we've all heard the current debates about the need to do something either at the user level or with the big social media providers to actually manage the regulation of distribution of information on the web. So this argument is not just theoretical, it has practical implications. And I guess it's no surprise that we find it especially discussed, therefore, when it comes to the implications it has at the political level, notably for the well-functioning of democratic institutions and democracy itself. I'm just quoting here one representative of the people who have carried this type of argument. Barack Obama, in his farewell address, for instance, has directly criticized bubbles, and before the quote I will read mentions that these bubbles are promoted by the web and social media. And it said that we have become so secure in our bubbles that we accept only information, whether true or not, that fits our opinions, instead of basing our opinions on the evidence that's out there. So that's the type of bad consequences reinforcing or previous belief because of the epistemic bubble that Obama has criticized. In another later interview on the BBC, this is the interview he did with Prince Harry, for people who saw that. He actually added that this is actually one of the dangers of the internet, that people then live in entirely different realities and are cocooned by information that reinforces their current biases. So here you see the type of argument that I just mentioned, the idea that there is something in informational bubbles that is fundamentally bad or mostly bad, and the fact that internet is promoting the formation or the growth of informational bubbles, and therefore that there is here a danger that we need to address. Politicians and public figures are not the only one who have defended this type of arguments, and you find it in various places, among philosophers, among intellectuals, and among scientists writing on various aspects of digital contents. The bubbles on social media especially have been accused of destroying democracy or explaining the rise of populism, and also sort of reinforcing polarization and some form of extremist positions. So it's definitely bad for democracy and the good running of democratic institutions. As a step beyond this anecdotal evidence, or at least these collections of quotes and proper names, I want to mention here a recent survey which was conducted at the beginning of last year in February by the Pew Center surveys, where they interviewed, so it's not a representative sample, so it's a sample of only tech experts, but about 1,000 of them. And the question that the survey asked these experts was, what will happen with the growing use of new technology when it comes to core aspects of democracy? And quite interestingly, the question was about a relatively short-term vision, that is between now and 2030, the next 10 years. How will the use of new technology affect democracy? Of course, social media and digital contents are not the only aspects here of technology, but they were central to the survey. And what you can see here is that almost half of the respondents think that new technologies will weaken democracy and democratic institutions. A third still think that there are ways in which it can strengthen the democratic process, and about 18 thought that it will have no effect. Among the topics that the survey isolates for amongst people who think that there will be a detrimental effect of new technologies on democracy, you can see here on the right, the idea will be that it will basically shift the balance of powers. So it will empower the people who are already powerful. So voices who already have a sort of epistemic authority will be amplified. And it will also exploit more and more the digital illiteracy, or the form of lack of digital numeracy and other form of epistemic weaknesses that we can have. There are other aspects. This is a very comprehensive survey, but what I want to stress here is that this general argument that epistemic bubbles are promoted by new technologies and will therefore have detrimental effects is widely shared. Now, I don't want to suggest that it is only a problem for democracy. The fact that there are informational bubbles that may be reinforced by new technologies and the web is also something that has been discussed in relation to other topics than directly political aspects. It might be bad for science if such informational bubbles also exist. It may be bad for health. We have seen it with COVID recommendations, for instance, and anti-vax, or the various information about health and remedies that can be erroneous will be amplified by informational bubbles. It's also generally bad if it just promotes ignorance of important facts and makes us miss important truth. And here, when you look at the ways in which this argument is run about why informational bubbles are bad, especially in connection with the web, you have a mixture of consequentialist arguments. It will have bad consequences for, let's say, public health. But it's blended with deontological arguments that, you know, this is a wrong principle. We shouldn't base our epistemic lives on this type of bubbles. And other types of arguments also insist that basically we're cultivating epistemic vices of being narrow-minded and being overconfident in our views instead of being open-minded, for instance. So Qasim Qassam, for instance, has written quite a lot about the epistemic vices that can come with an overconsumption of views similar to ours. So that's the sort of rough landscape of people who have held and defended the type of arguments I was talking about. That is the miseries of the web. Now, one thing that, before moving to my own response to this argument, I want to stress about the sort of restriction of the current argument and debate. Here, the topic is focused on informational bubbles. That is, looking at ways in which information about facts, statements which have or can have a truth value, statements about the past, statements about the present situation, or predictions about the future, how likely someone is to be elected, for instance, can be actually exchanged and bubbled on the web. Along with these statements with truth value, is also just providing the type of evidence which is provided, and there it can be pictures, for instance, that are provided as evidence, or arguments and justifications for these statements. And it can be data, it can be various forms of justification. But this is the epistemic domain, really, which is targeted here. And I don't want to discuss what happens when we think about bubbles, let's say, in the creative domain. So, for instance, maybe bubbles are good for the arts. Maybe it's good for innovation and industrial solutions. Maybe it's good also when it comes to the evaluative domain, or maybe it's not equally bad, for instance, when it comes to having bubbles for people who love the opera versus people who love jazz music, and so on and so forth. Same when it comes to more instrumental domains. I think the fact that there might be informational bubbles in the domain of sharing code or sharing data or sharing other resources on the web might also have different, require a different evaluation. So here we're only looking at bubbles regarding this informational aspect or epistemic domain. The second thing that is important in this argument, the argument really focuses on the fact that there is something about the structural aspect of the web, the way in which information is exchanged and distributed and disseminated, that promotes these bubbles. It's different from saying that there are types of contents, for instance, that can be circulated on the internet. Let's say you could imagine that it's easier to put certain extreme content on the dark web, and that this in itself will therefore enable people who before were alone with these contents to share this type of content and gather around more extreme contents. The distinction between vehicle and content is always a tricky one to draw, but I think this argument is really focused on the fact that there is something about the organization of the internet that is at fault here. So with this clarification in mind, I want to see where I allow myself to disagree with this type of view. It's not really on the first premise that indeed we should be worried about eventual bad consequences of informational bubbles, of the fact that they're founded on bad principles. But I want to mostly focus my disagreement or my correction on the second premise, and to show that according to the way I see things, the way actually information is structured on the web really requires bubbles. So instead of lamenting that the web promotes bubbles, we just have to accept that there is something intrinsic about digital contents and their vehicle that rest on bubbles. And therefore, the conclusion that one can draw is very different, because insofar as something good can happen through the web, then it has to come through bubbles. We have to put our hopes in the narrow possibilities of good aspects or good principles arising from informational bubbles. Therefore, my view is that mostly changing or regulations to try to burst bubbles is relatively pointless, but I will come back to these more controversial conclusions, as I said, only at the end. So the structure of the talk is really from there quite straightforward. I want to just see where I agree with the first premise about the possibly bad aspects of informational bubbles, but also see where there is hope for something good or something not that bad emerging from them. And then mostly focusing on my disagreement about the second premise. So a first clarification that is useful is, for the moment, I've been talking about informational bubbles or epistemic bubbles, and they are also sometimes mentioned. But the word echo chambers is also widely used, especially in the empirical literature. Now, these are two metaphors, so in a way, I'm happy for you to pick your metaphor. But to clarify exactly what I have in mind as a phenomenon, philosopher Nguyen has actually proposed to distinguish the epistemic bubbles, which is the phenomenon that mostly happens on the web, or at least is accentuated according to him on the web, whereby different voices are not heard. So there are some voices that you will never come across because you're in that bubble. This is something that is not of your doing. It's something that might have to do with the structure of the information, not your voluntary use of the web or the structure of the information. In echo chambers, by contrast, the idea here is that the other voices will be actively undermined. That is, if you're in an echo chamber and somebody joins and says something different or doesn't belong to the right category, then there will be an active movement to undermine what they said or just kick them out of the forum, unfollow them, and so on and so forth. So that's what creates an echo chamber. Now, it's an interesting distinction, and maybe we'll come back to this in discussion, but mostly I'm quite uncomfortable with it exactly describing. So I have less problem with the conceptual distinction that there are two mechanisms here: the omission, the absence of voices in certain conversational or informational spaces, and the mistrust. Because technically what we know is that omission, the fact that some voices are not heard, is not just accidental or built in the structure of institutions or the web, but we also have a form of deliberate omission and deliberate ignorance. So I don't think they're really just accidental omissions when it comes to that aspect. There are also a lot of our mistrust that instead of being active, it's actually quite passive and automatic. So we have a lot of involuntary and reflective negative attitudes towards certain opinions or voices. And we couldn't say that this is really the result of an active suppression or an active exclusion of these voices. But so far, I've accepted the terminology used by Nguyen that this is about selecting sources of voices, that is excluding or including certain people. But actually, it has a lot to do with types of content. I think sometimes we listen to the same source for certain types of content and not others. So the kind of phenomenon I have in mind when I talk about bubbles is not something which is based only on omission of suppression of information, but I think something which has this characteristic that you put a higher weight on certain types of information that is either redundant, similar, or congruent with the one you own. And along with this higher weighting, you have a tendency to repeat and reproduce that information. So it has to do with the weight and the redundancy or the repetition of that information. So with this definition in mind about what I have in as a target when I talk about epistemic bubbles, where can we say that the bad come from? This idea that bubbles are bad is, I think, the general doxa. So you find it across intellectual figures. So it's all through Cass Sutton's, for instance, 2017's book on the Republic, but also shared by actually most of my colleagues and friends, I think. So I'll be very curious to know what you think about informational bubbles. But the three problems with them, I think, have to do with the three following aspects. One is that there is a problem with the extension of information it gives us access to. This is something that Sandy Goldberg has called coverage reliability. The idea being that bubbles will not deliver us a sufficient broad and representative coverage of all the relevant information. So let's say we're talking about climate change. If you're in a bubble, you will not have the full extension and discussion of all the adequate number of facts or the appropriate number of evidence. The extension relative to this domain will be limited if you're in a domain. So it's an extensional argument. There is also a problem about the bubbles as I've characterized them, because the more a certain content is repeated, the more we tend to treat it as true or treat this content as a fact. There's a good literature showing that actually just repeating the same statement twice, seeing the same statement twice, appearing on the screen makes you consider the second repetition as more accurate than the first one. This is called the truth effect. And finally, it's not just about the fact that you will consider the statement as truth, but you might also consider the reliability of the evidence as higher, and therefore update your subjective confidence in that truth. So here the problem is that if you receive, let's say, confirmatory evidence from independent sources, you're justified to update your confidence and think that you're more justified to hold that belief. But if the information comes from people in the same bubble who have received themselves the information from the same source, then that upgrade in your subjective belief in the statement is no longer warranted. So if you're in a bubble, you're very likely to see the same statement appear multiple times, but because people are very likely to have obtained this statement or learn about this evidence from the same source, then their information is correlated, and the resulting confidence boost that you derive is actually unwarranted or unjustified. Here, just to refer to some recent work that we have been doing in our group, the demonstration that we try to make is that actually people are quite blind to the occurrence of this epistemic bubble effect. And it's not that much that we have to worry, therefore, that people are in bubbles, but mostly that they do not realize that they are in bubbles. In this online experiment, what we did is to present our participants with a sort of electoral scenario where they had to determine the likelihood of a candidate being elected in a small town's election based on the information provided by 5 informants. And along, you see it on the left, along with the estimates that each informant had relative to the probability of this person being elected, we also gave them the source of information from which the informants derived this estimate. And the variable here was that not only the content of the informant's estimate could vary, but we varied the correlation between their sources of information. What you have in the picture here, for instance, is a case where the 5 respondents provide different estimates regarding the probability, the low probability in that case, that the candidate will be elected. But 4 of them, it is shown, have derived their information from the same source. Only 1 has derived information, the second one, from a different TV channel. And what we could do by varying the number of sources and the content is to exactly see how much weight people were giving not only to the content, but the correlation between the sources when it came to updating their belief. And this is quite depressing, but this is the result. They were absolutely insensitive to the informational dependence or independence. When, like in the current picture, people were deriving their information from the same sources, their epistemic strategy for updating their belief was exactly similar to the one they would have if they were given informants deriving their information from different sources. We controlled also for the passivity. This is an objection that we had initially. We said, well, maybe people sort of will be more suspicious if they realize that people are motivated to derive their information from certain sources. And even when we said that these informants had chosen to watch these different TV channels, then the effects was the same. Whether people are basically involuntarily sharing sources or voluntarily exposing themselves to mainstream sources, the effect was the same. People don't care about the source of information. We're replicating partly some results here, but extending them also to more controlled way. I can go back to that as well. So it seems that basically when we're in bubbles, the problem is not that we draw on other people's information, but that we don't realize that we draw on information that is derived eventually from correlated sources. So we are bubble blind, basically. Now, the premise I stated is that epistemic bubbles are mostly bad, so there must be some good. And so where can the good come from? Well, it's interesting that here a lot of people have stressed that the good of epistemic bubbles or sharing information come from bonding, social bonds being reinforced, of people being less anxious regarding some uncertainty, political uncertainty or factual uncertainty, for instance. But these affective and social aspects are not primarily in my focus, because I want to focus on the epistemic aspects. And therefore, I want to look at the good aspects of epistemic bubbles regarding what I call the construction of shared reality. Now, shared reality is not, of course, a metaphysical notion. Is the reality doesn't depend on its being shared from an ontological perspective, but it's the fact that we can consider something as a reality through its being shared. So it's or treated something as a reality. And this depends basically on two things. Some of the aspects of shared reality depends on the target, and some on the responses. So in order for something to be a shared reality in that respect, we need first to have attention to the same object or the same target, actually. We also need to be not only randomly sharing attention to the same target, but also being mutually aware that we are sharing attention to the same target. This process is known as joint attention, so it has been much studied in psychology and neuroscience and developmental psychology particularly, and it's been shown to be absolutely central to the way we learn about the world, and we learn not only language but also facts about the world. So that's the way this by jointly attending to, let's say, nature, that will learn that something is called a duck, and then we'll learn facts about these ducks that we are jointly observing. But joint attention, if we follow philosophical arguments, might also be central to our very concept. The very fact that we develop the idea that reality can be shared is something that rests on the possibility that an object may not just be present to my mind, but actually may be present to more than my mind, that is, be attended by myself or present to myself and other people. Here, this is an argument which has been developed especially by philosopher Donald Davidson. And again, it's not to say that reality as a metaphysical entity is constituted by joint attention, but that our concept of reality is constituted by the possibility of joint attention. Now, there is another literature that has stressed that actually to be a shared reality, we need actually more than joint attention. In that case, it's if I have an object and we jointly attend to it, then this object is given to both of us, but it's still not sufficient to have incorporated it as a shared fact within our shared reality. What we need on top of that is for inner epistemic evaluation of this object to actually be similar. Here, the example would be, it's a bit of a philosopher's example, but imagine we are walking and then we both look at a barn, and actually I know this is actually a film stage set, so I know it's a fake barn. And you walk with me, we jointly attend to the fake barn, but you think on the contrary that it's a real one. In that case, this episode or this situation will satisfy the joint attention because we both share attention to this object out there. We both realize that we're attending to the same thing, but I treat it as a fake and you treat it as a real one. In that case, this object will not be joining a shared reality because I will treat it as fake, therefore discard it from being part of my reality or treating as a truth that, for instance, there is a barn here, whereas you will be incorporating the statement that there is a barn here in your sets of facts. So what we need on top of shared attention is actually a similarity on an alignment on our epistemic evaluation. Like for joint attention, we may need more than just us sharing the epistemic evaluation in order for us to realize that we're sharing this reality and we have both treated something as a fact. We need also to be mutually aware that we are sharing our epistemic evaluation of this fact. So here I'm drawing on literature that started in the 90s with people like Higgins and Etcherov, for instance, really stressing the need for more than joint attention for something to become a shared fact. Now, it's interesting here because what we see in this idea of shared reality is these two conditions. One is on the side of sharing attention to the same target, and the other on the sharing of similar or aligned responses. Now, we have joint attention, which is a cognitive perceptual mechanism that happens through social and sensory means. But the similarity of responses, just to tag it, is actually something that will be, if you already see it, promoted by sharing attention with people who also share epistemic attitudes and epistemic evaluation. Therefore, it will be promoted by epistemic bubbles. The more you share background epistemic attitudes, the more likely you are to share actual epistemic evaluations of new contents, and therefore the more you're likely to share reality with the people in question. So it seems that here we have at least one respect in which the bubble aspect can be beneficial in the sense that it promotes or serves a function of the constructions of shared reality or the acknowledgement of shared reality. Now, the second premise, which is the one with which I wanted mostly to disagree, is the idea that the way information is organized on the web actually has promoted bubbles. And here it is undeniable. This is a very simple diagram, but I think that's a fair description of the way in which content appears in front of us on screens, to come back to the topic and the title of the seminar series. The way information appears on our screen, given the myriad of contents that are available, is through tracking our responses and matching our interests inferred from our responses with people whose responses are similar. Now, similarity of responses is the basis that will lead us to attend to certain targets, and from these targets, it makes us more likely to actually also have similar responses to the people whose responses were responsible for us attending to this target. So a key example here will be, of course, content curation. So because you're interested, let's say, in cognitive science seminars, then you will be recommended a seminar based on people who are also interested in cognitive science seminars. Then you will attend to that seminar. You will probably interact with people and share or align your epistemic responses regarding to this new content. And your responses will also make you therefore more likely to share same targets with the people you were with. This is very much anywhere you can think about web browsers, social media, algorithm on Facebook as creating these bubbles. And this is actually the way I tend to think more and more about the web. And I think this is going down the route of thinking about the content being pieces of information might be wrong. And actually everything on the web is a form of recommendation. So it's an epistemic recommender system, but that's, I can go back to that later. Now, if the web is structured around bubbles, does it also sort of, by its inner logic, promote the growth or the multiplication of bubbles? Well, of course, if it is an epistemic recommendation system, we know that recommendation systems are based on recommending to you the content that people who are like you have already evaluated or liked or just seen, for instance, in the case of news. So there is an increase, definitely an increased homophilia or a generalization of homophilic tendencies when it comes to the web. There is also an increased opportunity for selecting the social media sources that we want to follow. Back in the days, the information we had for political events was mostly filtered through official media. And now, of course, there are many more voices that we can follow from politicians and alternative influencers or our friends and so on and so forth. At the same time, it's really not clear that this is the only aspects of the web that we should attend to, because there is also genuinely an increased diversity of news and information, and thinking about the coverage aspect here of facts that we can easily access. And there's also through the web an increased opportunity for incidental exposure. So as much as giving us the opportunity to be more selective in what we read or what we inform ourselves about, there's also a lot of serendipity that can happen through the web. So from a principled perspective, there's no reason, I think, to just think that everything on the web goes with the left side and nothing on the right side. When it comes to the empirical evidence, and here I need to rely on other people's work, it's not my area of expertise at all, but from what I've read in the most recent empirical evidence on how much actual overlap there is between people on social media, let's say Republicans and Democrats, Twitter account holders, there is a definitive amount, a clear amount of informational overlap. So conservative will follow conservative medias, will follow conservative politicians. But this is not such a black and white, as we would expect, a picture. Actually, this recent paper by Eddy et al. Shows that liberals tend to be in more bubbles than conservatives. And the issue is also that the people who are in bubbles on Twitter might actually also consume other medias, let's say on TV and so forth. That makes the conclusion that people are on bubbles not an easy one to draw. So I really don't think we can at least really have a clear certainty regarding the promotion of informational bubbles through the web, but I'm sure some people will disagree with me here, so I will leave that. More importantly, I want to go back to this initial idea that there is something structural about the way information is curated on the web that's not only rests on bubbles, but requires bubbles. And that's really my core, I think, novel twist on this debate. As I said, the problem of sharing reality in the sense of us realizing that there's something out there which is in common and is a fact that we both recognize as a fact, rests on these two sort of aspects. One is the fact that we realize that we're sharing attention to the same target. And this is mostly ensured through real social interaction and sensory means. So we know that the initiation of joint attention from very early age, but the way in which also in adulthood, for instance, we will maintain attention, check that we are still attending to the same thing, rests on sensory strategies such as following the gaze of the other people that we're with, but also tapping their shoulder or attending to what they say and so on and so forth. But this is something which is really grounded in a lot of sensory, minute form of sensory communication. If I want you to attend to something, I will not only turn my gaze toward these things, but I might also say, look, and point. So you will need to see the place where I'm pointing to. You will need to follow my gaze. You will need to attend to my vocalization, and they can be just a mere shout, for instance. So when you compare the way in which we can actually establish joint attention in the sense of coordinating our attention and being aware that we're attending to the same thing in the real world with what we can do in Zoom, it's the world of difference. I mean, I still cannot see how actually we could genuinely share attention in the same way through Zoom. I have no idea, for instance, where your gaze is directed at the moment. I only see my screen. Even when we're in a face-to-face conversation, I can follow your gaze, but I really have no idea whether you're looking at me on your screen or something else. And this problem is only worse when it comes to non-visual content. I have no idea, for instance, when I watched a video of a concert, whether other people are watching it at the same time, but I also have no idea who is reading the same news at the same time as me, or at even a different time. So I don't know whether we have shared attention or whether we are sharing attention in the same way. The only way we can do that is through highly cognitive and inferential means. And actually the means through which we can realize that we're sharing attention or have shared attention to the same content is by expression of attitudes. That is, we know who has liked or who has retweeted or who has commented, and therefore there is no way to separate or realization that people have responded to a content from the fact they have attended to it. And that's really what I think is the structural feature of digital content. That is, we use the similarity, the responses to the target as a guide to knowing that we've attended to the same thing. As much as an epistemic recommender system, in that respect, what we have is an epistemic attention curating system with the web. What I want to offer here is that in a way there is no other appropriate way to establish and maintain attention to the same target than actually curating contents which are given to you through showing that people responded to it and giving you the information about how many people responded to it in a similar way. And there is no other way structurally from the web than actually trying to recommend objects based on similarity of responses, because if it doesn't, then you're unlikely to attend to this targets. So both from your own perspective and from a structural perspective, using similarity of responses or tracking responses is the only way you can actually guarantee the sameness of attention. So I'm coming to an end here. So what I've added to the initial argument and the first premise is not really to challenge the fact that there are a lot to be worried about when it comes to informational bubbles, but to sort of nuance and qualify this statement by showing that in a way, these bubbles or this sharing of epistemic evaluation also contribute from joint attention to shared reality. Mostly my contribution consists in stressing that the way information is structured is not clearly, at least, promoting bubbles, but even if it does, anyway, the important premise here is that I think the web requires bubbles, because that's the only way in which joint attention can actually be established and maintained through tracking of people's responses. Therefore, insofar as something good can happen, it has to come through accepting this bubble aspect of the web. I said I would come back to the more controversial part, maybe about what we should do regarding the web. And I think here the call for bursting bubbles, not just pointless because maybe it's just practically impossible to do so if it's part of our cognitive and affective inclinations, but also we should worry that eventually this can misfire. Here, the argument would be better some shared reality than none. And I think it's still, if we have to choose between two challenges, it's better that we have people with believing in inaccurate statements or fake news, than actually people refusing to consider that there is any truth, or believing that there is no fact of the matter regarding some issues. In a way, if there is a recognition that there is something factual going on, that there is something which is susceptible of being evaluated regarding a truth value, then it offers grounds for disagreement when people change bubbles or are incidentally exposed to something outside their bubbles. What I don't mean to say is that we should just be content with the way the internet is structured, and especially the flow of information. And there are certainly strategies to improve epistemic bubbles. But I think acknowledging that we're improving it within this bubble structure is key to making the web and our consumption of information on screens better. So that's the conclusion. And on this, I want to thank my collaborators, especially from a project funded by the Nomis Foundation, Justin Solik and Bahadur Barami, and my collaborators here at the Cube, Meryl Fairhurst and Lucas Batic. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ophelia, for your most stimulating talk. And just to give some time to our participants to think about their questions, I'm going to take the privilege of moderating the session to ask you the first one. So, but how many realities are there? I mean, aren't there potentially as many realities as how many bubbles there are? So is this leading to a sort of relativistic notion of reality, since, and I think we can appreciate this phenomenon vividly as we speak, because we spend, at least those of us who have the privilege or the burden of spending most of their time facing a screen, everything gets funneled through the screen, and relatedly through the bubbles we are part of. So how can we reconcile this with the idea that there is a shared reality? I mean, there is a shared reality within each bubble. Is that what you mean?
So yes, that's the, thanks for the question. I think what, even myself, I'm a bit uncomfortable when I use this concept of shared reality, because obviously I'm not using it in a metaphysical way, right? I'm not saying that there is, it's not a metaphysical relativism or pluralism, which says there are many words, there are as many words out there. That's the,
at least at the epistemic level.
At the exactly, that's something. It's more like something being treated as reality. So or recognition that something should be recognized as a fact. You're right. There might be fact curation is put in bubbles. So for you and me, it's a fact that COVID-19 is a real threat, and that it might be a fact that it's, or at least there is a very high probability that it has an animal origin. And then for other bubbles, then it doesn't exist, or it exists, but it's actually an engineered virus. So in that respect, there will be indeed as many fact tribes. I mean, we have read about moral tribes, but I think that what we have are reality tribes. That's what belongs to the shared reality. That is, we don't have another way. Maybe because it's more coming from the communication and language side. I haven't used the notion of common ground, but I think we could replace that. There are as many common grounds as they are epistemic bubbles. The only thing that moderates the conclusion that therefore we're doomed, because how can we build a democracy if people don't consider that's the same thing is a fact or not a fact, or that's there is no room for common ground. The fact that we're not doomed is that I don't think we're totally in impenetrable bubbles. The evidence showed that we are bubbled. We're probably blind to our bubbles, but we're not totally devoid still of common ground, and therefore encouraging the biggest bubbles possible is probably the solution. You're still muted. Sorry, Vittorio. That's fine.
When people used to buy newspapers, you could see funny scenes at newsstands. So, for example, a chap comes and buys a left-wing newspaper. The people behind is staring at you in a very aggressive way because he's going to buy. I mean, I buy Figaro, you buy Liberazione, or the other way around. So in a way, we were living already in an informational bubbles. I mean, people select sources of information on the basis of their political credo, conviction, and the like. So what brings the digital bubble new with respect to this?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether that's why for me, the argument that there is some sort of quantitative difference, meaning that we were in epistemic bubbles, we maybe in virtue of our cognitive and affective inclinations needs to be or will be in epistemic bubbles. That is, we will surround ourselves with information that confirm our previous information. With friends, we have the same views. We read the newspapers that are in line with our political preferences. The argument being, oh, this is just extended. I think there is something very specific here in the digital content, because the opportunity that we had before to realize through joint attention that there is something outside our bubble through the real social interaction is missing in the web. You cannot incidentally come across a fact and realize you're jointly attending to it without immediately being exposed to the fact that people are responding to this content in a certain way. So we have no access, and it's both, maybe this part was a bit fast and it's still the one I'm trying to clarify in my own head. It's both the way information is curated by social media and browsers, that they will give us to attend to content from people who are similar to us regarding their responses. But when I look at a tweet, I will immediately see how many people I know or I follow have liked it or responded to it. And so whether I will invest and maintain attention to this content also depends on what I observe the responses of people being like me is. So my access, my attention is curated by my understanding or my awareness of other people's responses. If I see a content that all my political opponents like and retweet, I might be curious, but it's not something I will continue to attend to or really invest a lot of effort checking. I think this is rubbish. So that's the mediation. My attention goes via my awareness of the responses. Whereas before, we also had the other opportunity to have attention first and then observe people's responses in real life. That's the... Next question.
Sorry, yes, the mute. The next question comes from Francesco Casetti. Please, Francesco.
Thank you, Ophelia. It's very interesting, and I try to answer to some of your questions to my own talk in 15 days. I speak from a country in which 1/3 of population lives in an alternative reality. And I'm not sure that sharing a word is better than not sharing a word. And the strategies of this third of population on trusting each other and believing a reality, they fulfill perfectly all the elements you mentioned: joint attention, epistemic evaluation, similar responses. I would add also intense interpretation of reality. For example, the QAnon, they belong to the same community because they have the same procedural interpretation of facts to find the number 17 in what happens around them. So this is a controversial point about the multiverse in which we live, but is a point. There is a second point, if you want. If when you were speaking about what I think is a very strong issue, the web as a recommended epistemic system, that's a great point. But if I look at the newspaper in liberal, in the liberal age, in the liberal, let's say, public sphere, to speak with Habermas, also the newspaper was, for some reason, a recommended epistemic system. Don't you find some connection between the old and the new in the media?
Excellent, two excellent questions, and I will look forward to your response in 2 weeks' time. About whether the absence of shared reality or the diminished shared reality or common ground, whether we should regret it or think it's good. I think this is where it's very difficult to disentangle the epistemic from the political here, because one could be, I think, fine with people living in different regimen of evidence and treating as facts things that we don't recognize as facts, if these people were not then electing the people who will govern us as well. So that's a problem, and for me, I'm a bit uncomfortable because I feel less confident bridging to the political consequences, because I'm not a political scientist, I'm not a political philosopher. I can see that at least what makes the danger of unshared reality or the diminishing of common ground has to do with the political consequences. I see direct consequences in practical terms. If people start to believe in absurdities regarding their health, then it can be a danger for me as well, right? Anti-vaxxers and their alternative reality and refusal to get vaccinated might become a direct threat to my health or the health of people I love. So in this respect, I think it's very difficult to not see it from the bad consequences at the political and practical level. Would that be otherwise? Is there something wrong from a more deontological perspective or an epistemic virtue perspective? If some people are ignorant, or some people are or if people are more expert than me and they share a reality I have no access to, and certainly there's a lot of in the scientific domain where I probably don't share that reality, the same recognition of facts, then I don't think this that problematic, but I would need to think more about that. I think the practical and political consequences make this bad enough. That's your second point regarding the newspapers and the official media. This is really, as I said at the beginning, this is a sort of big picture view which is in development. What I'm pointing at, the direction I'm interested in taking, is to say that with the newspaper, you're provided a content, you don't have the immediate responses of the people reading the newspapers. So you might have information about how many other issues of the newspapers have been printed. Therefore, you know how many people have read that content. But you might, you don't have all the comment. You know, the big thing with any news article on the internet is that you don't just have the news, you have all the comments of people who have read that article. You have the number of likes and dislikes and thumb up and thumb up. So you're immediately aware not just of how many people have seen that content, but what the responses to the content have been. And that's the difference, because you're immediately aware of how aligned or not aligned your responses toward this content are with the people. So that's
so much. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We have two more questions. One from Anna Strasser and then Gloria Origi.
Hi, that was really a great talk, Ophelia. I liked it a lot. So I agree that bubbles play an important role for joint attention in the construction of shared reality. And what you said about the inner epistemic evaluation reminded me on a recent attempt to clarify the notion of bullshit by Romy Jaster. He refers to norms of justification. So she's explaining bullshit as an indifference towards certain norms of justification. So my question is, could we evaluate certain bubbles according to certain norms of justification? Because I do not see how anything good can come out of a Corona-Leugner bubble. So then we had a method to distinguish between bubbles with certain norms of justification and other bubbles which have rather strange norms of justifications. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think the problem with everything I was trying to put on the table is dealing with it at a sort of level of conceptual generality. You know, it's like looking at the whole web landscape, and of course, you know, you could push any argument in the different directions once you apply it to a specific domain. So I would say, you know, if people are really sharing conspiracy theories and crazy content, that's why at the beginning I was trying to distinguish between the problems that have to do with the way information is delivered and disseminated, from the fact that the web also promotes certain types of contents and views. Now, it's a difficult distinction. Vehicle content is also a bit metaphorical, and of course, you know, in certain cases, it's because the vehicle is there that the contents are there. When it comes from norms of justification, I'm not sure, therefore, whether they are not really part of the vehicles, they are not really part of the content. There are some people who have discussed in much more detail about the fact that maybe internet doesn't promote exchange of genuine arguments because people shout at each other rather than providing arguments. So maybe along this line there will be something, but I don't think it's intrinsic to the way the web is structured, the way in which social media operate, which really have to do with being based on recommendation algorithms, basically, which treat similarity as the alpha and the omega of what will appear on your screen. There are more and more clever ways of treating similarities, but from Netflix to Amazon to Twitter and Instagram, and even the apps through which you will read the newspapers, everything is based on this similarity of responses. So that's the direction I was taking, and I'm not sure regarding the problem of justifications, actually. So I'm avoiding to respond to your question.
Thank you. I think I will have the chance to ask again.
Okay, so the next question is from Gloria Origi. Please,
Thank you,
Gloria.
Vittorio. Thank you, Ophelia. That was super interesting. I see other two hands raised, Guido Sedone and Nogariga. Maybe they were before me, but I don't know if you see.
No. You're
okay,
your
great.
turn now.
Thank you so much. That was really super new and interesting. And I just wanted to ask you, in these epistemic tribes that exist on the web, the mechanism to establish what is a fact seems to be, I mean, this way of coordinating gazes, I mean, on a certain content seems to be yet very different from the mechanism we use to establish a reality outside the web. I mean, the way of coordinating gazes outside the web. Because one aspect that interests me for my own research, etc., that is so present in making reality is rankings. I mean, the fact that this piece of information has been liked many times, and this so how does, because, and I mean, in the way in which we shape reality with a shared gaze outside the web, where you can see there is a form of ranking or even there, because we look at the gaze of, I don't know, the most prestigious person in the room. But I mean, it's more controversial, I think. I mean, there is a simple sort of Davidsonian picture of how reality is made by the shared intentionality that excludes any ranking. Yeah. So how this aspect, how this parallel you make fits with this aspect?
To highlight that the usual mechanisms of sharing attention, which are constitutive for us to recognize something as shared reality, are not curated at all in similar ways when it comes to the web. And the way they are curated is through giving us epistemic information, not just about that it is attended, but how it is evaluated. So it can be ranked, it can be, you know, here the number of people are my friends who are exactly. So it is through this, not only do I know that you are attended, but I know what your evaluation in response to this object is. And I think that's exactly the key difference coming from the web. I was trying to, you put it beautifully with the ranking aspect. You know, I think that's one thing which is very, very seldom part of our accounts of joint attention, especially dyadic, you know, joint attention, and that's and definitely is part of. I will know how high, you know, and I will have this comparative attention as well, which is probably also, you know, what is most attended to at one time. So it's a very different structure. That's exactly it. Thank you. So maybe the next question, if you put it in the chat, then I will answer it, or I don't know whether it's possible to give selective speech without welcoming the unwelcomed. maybe Giorgio? Yeah. Guido, I think. Does Guido and Noga had questions as well? So Guido is yeah, can you just type your question maybe, Guido? Or I think that was the suggestion to avoid the...
Okay, I think it's working now.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Ophelia, for your talk. So I also think you're right in saying that the web requires bubble instead that just promoting it. I think it's a good idea to try to unveil some mistakes in the organization of the web. Nonetheless, I think there are some theoretical issues in your approach, particularly when you try to regain some sort of sharedness and some sort of joint intentionality or joint attention in order to build some kind of sure and certain knowledge. So some knowledge that is not just based on bubbles, so on small small forms of experiencing reality, let's say so. So the question is this: that somehow, so you mention it at the very beginning of your talk, when you say that the problem is in the web just to furnish vehicles for gaining information rather than just ways of evolving contents, and this you said produces some forms of unreflective mistrust, and you are very true in this point. The question is, I think that the way in which the web is organized is somehow biased by some sort of empiricism. So biased by the idea that knowledge is just information, is just producing information. We know that knowledge is not just information. Human knowledge is not just information because human beings are not machines, so they are not computers. For us, knowledge is contents, as you said, so that is articulation of reasons, inferential articulation of reason, and discussing about our reasons and our ideas. And so I think in order to regain some sort of sharedness, some sort of joint attention, we need, I think, really to reflect on this aspect, that the web is built on a very empiricist idea of knowledge, just furnishing information. But knowledge is not information. Knowledge is much more. And we see that, for example, when we teach in the universities and also in the schools, that evolving rational capacities in the young student means evolving their capacity to articulate reason and to discuss them and to challenge also others' reasons and so on.
Yeah.
And when we had Vittorio's talk a few weeks ago, I also mentioned the necessity in the web to have some authoritative reason, so to somehow develop some filter or some better, no, I would say better to evolve to evolve an education that would allow us to better interact with the information, particularly the young people can gain from the web.
Yeah.
So we need really to skip the problem of empiricism, I think, in the web, and to regain some sort of dialogical conception of knowledge.
I agree. Yes, yeah, no, totally. So maybe I will try and respond to your point in the following way. I think we can look at three different aspects, right? I mean, one is the type of content. The one that I was focusing on is how these contents come to be under our epistemic appraisal. Just the very fact that that we attend to certain pieces of information. So one is really the nature of the content. The other was the presentation of these contents. And what you're pointing at is the third point, which is our capacities to both from our own side evaluate these contents or benefit from seeing other reasons and not just statements of facts coming from the web. Now, I totally agree that these are three important aspects of thinking about the construction of knowledge or the development of knowledge or the transmission of knowledge on the web. At the same time, I'm less convinced that there is something intrinsic or inherent to the web regarding the absence of good arguments. The thing, and I think that was also where Gloria Origi's questions was coming from, is really that the web has really changed the way we attend to different pieces of information, what comes across our attention and what we pay attention to, and what we will start to epistemically evaluate. So the facts are really changed. It's true that on Twitter, people don't exchange very good arguments many times, but they can exchange good arguments. It's true that on knowledge platforms like Wikipedia, we can see that it's a bit too empiricist, but I don't think it's built in the structure of Wikipedia that there cannot be exchange of arguments in the background and so on. So my response would be there that it is a fact, as you say, that providing and discussing reasons, it may not be prominent on the web, but I don't think it's a structural feature of the internet. That would be my...
Yeah, but this is a problem. So, I mean, the problem of the bubbles is this one. So the problem that we are not able really to, or better, probably the younger users are not able to filter and to scrutinize the information they gain through internet, because they are not in the condition to evolve a dialogical reason. So,
but you would agree that even if they did, that's why the problems are orthogonal. Even they did have the capacity, if every content they're presented with is fake, okay. You know, that every text, every article, or every picture and so on, that will have a different damage to their epistemic lives. That's I think maybe this was Anna Strasser's also point, that of course there is a question of having the right epistemic norms, being able to articulate reasons for one's degrees of beliefs in different contents and so on. And that's definitely something from an anecdotal or observational perspective that we can lament about on the internet. Like, the question I always have is whether these are really grounded. Are people less critical because the internet has taken up a large part of our life? I'm not sure.
I'm sorry. I think that they are less critical because we are losing a very traditional idea of reason and knowledge as a fact of confronting and discussing about idea. And by the web, we are unfortunately evolving a too empiricist conception of knowledge based just on information. But there is a huge difference between knowledge and information.
No,
Okay.
and I wasn't really like going so far as talking
The
about
problem is pedagogical, I think. So we just have to better educate the young students to interact with the information in the web, not just as knowledge, but just as a way of gaining just information. But information has to be scrutinized, has to be evaluated. This is a step forward in comparison to the plain empiricist approach to this to knowledge per
No,
se.
exactly. I think you're absolutely right.
So I think we just have to change and to regain a traditional approach to knowledge, like that, for example, in the ancient Greek philosophy or in the German classical philosophy and so on.
Yes. So great. I see just that Noga Arika also has a question for Wild. So I don't know whether.
Yes.
Hope we can take the question.
Can
yes.
you hear me?
Great. Without
You can't see me though.
catastrophe happening.
Yeah. It was great. It was so interesting. I think you have an incredibly important point here about this the curating as the mark of shared attention. I think it's really interesting. No, I was actually thinking about this bubbles. I mean, first of all, bubbles are both resilient and fragile. Actually, they're more fragile than resilient, if we're going to take that image literally as a bubble. And a bubble is only defined as such in relation to what is outside it. And so otherwise you have no bubbles. So, and I'm thinking maybe this, we're talking about the kind of the epistemic sophistication needed to be aware of bubbleness. Where would that come from? That would rejoin what Guido Sedoni was just saying, the kind of education beyond the bubbles to be able to then see the bubbleness of the bubble. As otherwise, you don't know that you are in some cloud la la land of alternative reality, which is what we're lamenting. And of course, what we're talking about here is also what degree of overlap. There is no, well, we know there is no total overlap between the bubble and the landscape behind the bubble or around the bubble. That therefore, there's no total overlap between the web and the wider multiple reality. And so what we're talking about is how in a sense is how the web reality is informing then our interpretation of the outside bubble reality. Then you could see what is on the other way around. It's not a symmetrical relation. It's not as if the outside how much is the outside reality informing what is in the bubble. And I'm thinking, what is the quality of there's an asymmetrical relation between web W to R reality versus R to W. And I'm thinking one of the aspects that we're not addressing here, talking about the cognitive epistemic value of what's within the bubble, but a lot of what is going on, like what would just happen to us now, our bubble was burst by some huge, the kind of rage manifested in those Zoom bombs. That's rage, it's emotional amplification, right? That we have a lot, and the bubbles are often expanded. I was going to say to bursting point, but they don't burst, that's the point, by the emotional amplification provided by this internal. So there's a lot of affective dimension, right, of the exchanges in the web that is then going to inform then the whatever cognitive, whatever grasp we may or may not have on reality. And I'm thinking that may be also the thing to talk about, which is what is the affective level of interpretation of reality? What are we looking at? Are we talking about how the affect is how our affect is interpreting is enable us or not to interpret what's within the bubble, or is it interpreting what's outside the bubble? And this is what I'm trying to grasp, is the boundaries of the bubble.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much, Noga, for and really, I'm trying to navigate my own way through this very complex set of issues, and I think the fact that this seminar series exists just help us try to clarify some of the things that are going on. And the link between your first point was about the link between these epistemic bubbles as they're created by the web, and so the type of things we attend to digitally and in reality. And here, of course, some will be the same across these two spaces. So, you know, if there is a protest in Paris and you live in Bastille, then you have your direct real life evidence, and you also have the live digital comments coming about what is going on, and these two just combine. For many of our access to certain types of information, being abstract information or geographically distant information, then we're entirely dependent on the web. And I don't think there is much overlap about what's happening at the moment in Russian protests is only given to me via digital content and printed newspapers, and I'm not sure where they sit in the boundary, in the divide between real life and digital contents now. So to this, I agree that there's a complex set of relations of cases. Your second point on the affective dimension of bubbles. This is where a lot, as I'm sure many people here are aware of, debate is happening about whether these bubbles are generated because we share the same epistemic attitudes, and if we include political attitudes in there, and whether we think, on the contrary, that they're generated by affective or sharing of affective attitudes because we like certain statements, or we want certain statements to be true. When I was digging and looking at this literature by the Higgins on the construction of shared reality, they're much more on your side actually than probably what I was representing in the talk. That is, along with the fact that we have joint attention and that we are aware that we are sharing attention to the same object, what they think is constitutive of acknowledging that something is the fact for us is that we share an affective response to this object.
Right.
And I think the developmental literature will probably give you reasons, although most people study the epistemic dimension. Oh, this has this name and this has these properties. But probably the affective response, the fact that here is a cute toy and we see that there is an alignment of affective responses toward this object that we're jointly attending to, is grounding the sharing of the presence of the toy or as a fact, and probably the sharing that this is a toy dog, for instance, and the learning of the name. Later on, the fact that we attend to news as well is probably, or to certain contents on the web is hugely curated by the fact that we like these contents and we want to share our affective responses. So I pushed it on the side because I think there's still a respect in which these bubbles have a genuine epistemic dimension, especially when it comes to certain media, like Twitter maybe is at least as epistemic as it is affective. Some are more affective. Wikipedia might be more epistemic and less affective when it comes to other media. I wouldn't be able to give an exact list, but
yeah,
that I think you're right, and I think the literature gives you a lot of good arguments that it's not possible to think about bubbles as being only grounded in shared epistemic attitudes.
No, no. But also, how do we burst them is the question. You know, how do we burst this? And I was thinking maybe one way is like you creating, you know, web facilitated conversations, live conversations, inviting wide ranges of people, but who would come? I mean, that's the thing. I mean, how do you do that? How do you change that culture?
That's true. And I see that actually Vittorio has typed another question linked to yours about whether there's a peculiar emotional quality characterizing the sharing of contents within a given bubble. That's a question for empirical investigation, Vittorio.
Right. I mean, there is some literature that apparently shows that, for example, within chatting rooms or people that debate a given content, a given topic, the more the debate goes on, the more negative emotion tend to prevail. So I wonder whether you have given a thought about possible ways instead of bursting the bubble, because according to your definition, since the web presupposes bubbles, that might be difficult. Whether is there any research that you are aware of in trying to contrast this prevailing of negative emotion within each bubble?
No, what is sure is that I think there's a way in which probably if we manage to only be in an epistemic bubble, that's the way to protect ourselves from disagreement. And disagreement is characterized by negative emotions. If the agreement comes within our bubble, I think we're quite emotionally either neutral or positive about it. I guess your question is whether the disagreement comes from someone within our bubble, whether we respond to it less negatively than if the disagreement comes from somebody outside our bubble. Was it the... Yeah. I mean, then we go in the in-group, out-group literature, and I'm not so sure. One big challenge at the moment with mapping our lives on screens and is that we are borrowing a lot of conceptual tools from non-screen life, like in-group and out-group. And of course they blend and they have shaped the way the web and contents are organized, but they're also emerging phenomena. And I don't think that it's so simple. We are part of so many different bubbles at any time, for instance, whereas yeah, I wouldn't be able to think on the top of my head about something which has addressed this issue of our response to disagreement within the bubble literature, and whether the disagreement is coming from somebody you trust or you don't trust, or somebody who's an in-group or an out-group, has been covered elsewhere. But this is not exactly similar to the web situation when I think that what just happened about the feeling of invasion of of privacy, although Zoom is a public space, is a very interesting phenomenon actually. That's you know, as this very distinction between public and private is totally challenged by web spaces.
Okay, thank you. Are there more questions?
I'm available anyway on email for private Zoom conversations for follow-up.
Okay, if there are no further questions, I wish, first of all, apologize with you all for this very first Zoom bomb, hopefully the last one. Next time, we'll try to take a stricter measure, prohibiting the sharing of the screen. And I wish to thank Ophelia for your great talk and the elaboration of your contents along the discussion, and say goodbye to everyone in 2 weeks. Thank you for being with us. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Vittorio. Thanks, everyone, and for the question and discussion.
Bye.
Bye.